On the broadcast tonight, search efforts for the missing in the Sewol-ho ferry disaster continue, but progress is slow. Meanwhile, the investigation expands as the prosecution looks deeper into the case. And the ferry disaster isn't just taking a toll on Korea's national psyche and domestic consumption. It may also have a political impact, with local elections coming up in about a month. And in a developing story, dozens are reportedly injured when two subway trains collide in Seoul. We'll have the details on Early Edition at 6. It is 5 a.m. in New York, 5 p.m. in Beijing, and 6 on a Friday evening here in Seoul. This is Early Edition at 6, live from Seoul. I'm Moon Gon-young.
And I'm Sean Lim. Thank you so much for joining us for the newscast.
Now, we begin with this breaking news. Two subway trains collided with one another in Seoul this Friday afternoon, causing at least or up to 170 injuries.
Let's go directly to our Leon for the latest. So, Leon, how serious is the situation, and have there been any serious injuries reported?
Guys, a subway train traveling on line 2 that was heading from Sangwang-simri Station to Seongsu Station collided with a subway car that was stationary at around 3:30 p.m. Korea time. Seoul Metro says about 170 people have been injured, but that includes minor injuries as well. About 20 people are already receiving treatment at Hanyang University Hospital near Sangwang-simri Station, and the rest at 7 nearby hospitals. None of the injuries are reported to be life-threatening. Witnesses say the subway car was packed with the seats filled and many standing when the accident occurred, and that a lot of the passengers were elderly.
Well, do we know what caused the two trains to collide?
Well, John, witnesses say one of the trains seemed to be having a technical problem, that it was slowing down and stopped and started a number of times before it crashed into the subway car ahead. They say they heard a loud crashing noise, which caused many in the subway cars to fall down immediately. The lights also went off at the same time. They say they did not receive any instructions or announcements for about 20 minutes, causing a lot of confusion and disruption. Now, after that, they had to force the subway doors open and escape on the subway tracks to the next station. As for the cause, we are not yet sure. One of the subway drivers that was involved in the accident has been moved to the hospital, so officials say they will have to talk to the engineer to find out more about any possible causes. What we do know is that the two subways were not automatic but manually driven by these drivers. The Ministry of Land, Infrastructure and Transport also announced less than an hour ago that it will organize a central countermeasures headquarters to look into the possible cause to see if it was due to a malfunctioning engine or due to some kind of a mistake by the drivers of the subway cars.
Now, Leon, subway line 2 is one of the busiest lines here in Seoul. Are subway services being halted around the site of the accident?
Ganyang subway services to a total of 9 stations before and after the station where the accident occurred, which is from Ulji로 Ilga Station to Seongsu Station, have now been halted. The roads above, also around the Sangwang-simri Station, have been blocked by emergency cars parked around the site. So a lot of traffic is expected around the station in northern central Seoul, guys.
All right, thank you so much for that report.
And now let's bring you the latest on the Sewol-ho ferry disaster, which is now in day 17. The confirmed death toll now stands at 226, with 76 still unaccounted for.
For more on the search operation and the ongoing investigation, we have our Kim Ji-yeon joining us from the news center. Ji-yeon, one body was found earlier today outside the ferry, 4.5 kilometers away from the ferry site, in fact. and it's raising questions about whether the parameters of the search should be expanded.
Well, guys, that may be the case here. There are growing concerns that the bodies of the victims might never be found, as some were clearly carried away from the accident site by currents. 2 days ago, another body was found 2 kilometers northeast of the accident site in the opposite direction from the one found today. So it's hard to predict which way the bodies might be carried away, but also how far the search area may need to be expanded. Some of the victims' belongings have been found as far as 30 kilometers away from the ferry. Layers of nets were set up around the site a week after the ferry first capsized. So there's a question of whether the bodies drifted out to sea before or after they were set up. The task force focused on preventing the loss of the victims' bodies says it will intensify a search with the help of more than 200 fishing boats near Chindo Island.
Gian, in terms of the investigation, local courts are trying to determine the validity of the arrest warrants issued for 2 senior employees of the ferry operator on charges of negligence. Now, is there anything new on that front?
Well, an employee identified only by a surname Kim, who was in charge of loading cargo onto the Cheonghaejin Marine Company's vessels, admitted today that he knew that overloading cargo on the ferry could cause it to capsize. He said this after being questioned repeatedly by reporters on the matter. The investigation into employees of the ferry operator is giving weight to speculation that the company knew of the dangers of overloading cargo, but chose not to heed the warnings, possibly out of a pursuit for profits. Prosecutors obtained testimony from the Sewol-ho ferry captain Lee Jun-seok and from the ship's senior navigator, and they said they had raised concerns to Kim, the man in charge of loading the cargo, many times before about there being too much cargo on board. Authorities say more than 3,600 tons of cargo was loaded onto the Sewol-ho ferry on April 16th, which is 3 times more than its recommended capacity. And also, prosecutors arrested another senior employee today on suspicions of manipulating the figures on how much cargo was actually on the Sewol-ho ferry on records upon news that the ferry sunk.
And some key figures in connection to the owner, Yoo Byung-eun, including his brother-in-law, refused to answer the summons for questioning earlier today.
That's right, Sean. This is the second time Yoo's brother-in-law, Yoo Hyuk-gi, who has permanent residency in the United States, has refused to answer to the summons related to the ferry sinking. The authorities are trying to close in on those related to the practical owner of the ferry company, Yoo Byung-eun, to find business irregularities that may have contributed to the ferry sinking. But they are having difficulties since people like Yoo's brother-in-law have refused to answer to the summons. The prosecutors gave a new deadline for Yoo Hyuk-gi to answer to the summons by next Thursday. The prosecutors say that this is an ultimatum, and if he doesn't answer this time, they will proceed with necessary measures, although they did not specify what those measures might be. I'll bring more updates later today.
Meanwhile, President Park Geun-hye says she believes it is her duty to officially apologize for the ferry disaster.
Meeting with religious leaders on Friday, the president said she will do all she can to ensure that the missing passengers are found and once again pledged for an overhaul of the national disaster response system. President Park's remarks come amid criticism of her apology earlier this week during a cabinet meeting where she said she was sorry for the government's insufficient emergency management. Some believe she should have addressed the Korean people directly. Referring to how rumors about the disaster response have hurt the families of the victims and caused social confusion, the president vowed to work to regain the trust of the people. If you're here in Korea, you may have noticed that election fever is heating up. Koreans will take to the polls in just over a month from now for local elections.
But the Sewol-ho ferry tragedy looms over the campaigns, with the rival parties doing what they can to distance themselves from the government. However, as our Choo-sun tells us, the ruling party could take a hit come election day.
The Sewol-ho ferry disaster has completely overshadowed the upcoming local elections in June. With only about a month to go before the polls, the ruling and opposition parties are keeping their campaigning relatively low-key as public criticism of political leaders grows over their inability to cope with such disasters. The latest surveys show poor government handling of the man-made disaster dragged President Park Geun-hye's popularity ratings to below 50% for the first time in a year. In the past, it's been the government and ruling party that have suffered the most politically from a disaster, giving the opposition an upper hand. But this time around, public mistrust spreads from the government to both ends of the political spectrum. In a move likely intended to distance itself, the ruling Saenuri party on Friday criticized the government for its mishandling of the crisis. Party floor leader Choi Kyung-hwan then urged officials to mobilize to help the families of the missing passengers who have not been working since the Sewol-ho disaster on April 16th. The opposition New Politics Alliance for Democracy, on the other hand, said onus of the disaster falls on the government and its absence of a sufficient disaster management control tower. Co-leader Kim Han-gil said instead of waiting for the government to determine who's responsible for the ferry's capsizing, the National Assembly should lead the efforts. Despite the political blame game, political observers say the outcome of June 4th elections may be determined more by voter turnout, as many Koreans still feel despondent over the tragedy. Choi Yu-sun, Arirang News.
Digging deeper, getting to the bottom of stories that impact your life, talking with you on air and online, connecting you with experts on the world's most pressing issues. News and current affairs at its best with Moon Gon-young and Daniel Che on Early Edition at 6.
North Korea has a new number 2 within the regime. Choi Dong-hae is out and Hwang Byung-seo is in as top military commander. But no word yet on the reason for the sudden shakeup. Arirang News' Hwang Sang-hee has this report.
Out goes Choi Dong-hae, in comes Hwang Byung-seo. North Korea has replaced its top military commander in a sign the regime's young leader may be struggling to maintain his grip on power. Reporting on a May Day event Friday, the North Korean Central News Agency introduced Hwang as the country's military politburo chief. North Korea watchers are keeping a close eye on Hwang, who was promoted to the position of vice marshal less than 2 weeks after becoming a 4-star general. Why Choi was replaced remains unclear, but Kim Jong-un's recent criticism of military officers suggests it could be more than Choi's reported health problems. The latest power shift comes less than 6 months since the execution of Kim's uncle Jang Sung-taek, and some see it as a sign the young leader's grip on power is still shaky. But South Korea's unification ministry says it's too early to jump to any conclusions.
We were certain about the purge of Jang Sung-taek and the dismissal of Lee Yong-ho because it was reported after the extended meeting of the Political Bureau of the Party Central Committee. So far, there have been no such reports on Choi Dong-hae.
Meanwhile, hopes for better inter-Korean ties are fading fast amid the regime's ongoing threats of a 4th nuclear test and cross-border slandering. North Korea has been stepping up its aggressive rhetoric since U.S. President Barack Obama's visit to Seoul last week, when he vowed to stand shoulder to shoulder with South Korea against any provocation by the North. Experts say this is part of North Korea's efforts to find its way back to the negotiating table. Hwang Sang-hee, Arirang News.
Meanwhile, a group of overseas business leaders returned from a one-day visit to the Inter-Korean Joint Industrial Complex in the North Korean border city of Kaesong this Friday. The 30-member group, including 17 business leaders of the World Federation of Overseas Korean Traders Association, made the trip with hopes of boosting cross-border economic exchanges. Now, during this visit, they reportedly held talks with North Korean officials on the possibility of establishing factories at the complex and future investments with an eye on globalizing the joint industrial complex. This is the first time for a group of overseas business leaders to visit the Inter-Korean Factory Park.
Washington has apparently tapped its next ambassador to South Korea. He's currently the chief of staff to Defense Secretary Chuck Hagel and has been a close advisor to U.S. President Barack Obama for years. Our Kwon So-ah tells us more about him.
Mark Lippert, one of U.S. President Barack Obama's oldest and closest aides, has been nominated to be the United States' next ambassador to South Korea. Multiple diplomatic sources say the U.S. government notified Seoul of the impending announcement during President Obama's visit to the nation last week. If confirmed by the U.S. Senate, Lippert will replace the current ambassador Song Kim in the second half of the year. Kim, whose 3-year term is nearing an end, is expected to return to the State Department in September. As for Lippert's credentials, the 41-year-old is currently Defense Secretary Chuck Hagel's chief of staff. At the age of 32, he became the foreign policy advisor to then-Senator Barack Obama. 4 years later, he was appointed as National Security Council Chief of Staff and in 2012 as Assistant Secretary of Defense for Asian and Pacific Security Affairs. Experts anticipate that Lippert will strengthen relations between Seoul and Washington. Former Assistant Secretary of State for East Asian and Pacific Affairs Kurt Campbell was quoted as saying that South Korea would be lucky to have Lippert, who is close to the president, as U.S. ambassador. Lippert is expected to focus on bolstering trilateral cooperation between the U.S., Korea, and Japan, particularly when it comes to countering North Korean threats. According to Pentagon officials, Lippert believes that security cooperation and historical disputes should be approached separately. This could be a concern to Korea due to sensitivity over Tokyo's interpretation of history and territorial claims. Nevertheless, South Korea's embassy welcomes Lippert's nomination as he has a good reputation among diplomats in the country. Kwon So-ah, Arirang News.
Korean auto sales in the U.S. spiked last month on the back of improved economic conditions and low interest rates. And it was the biggest ever sales total for the month of April for Korea's largest automaker, Hyundai Motor.
Hyundai sold more than 66,000 units in the U.S. in April, a near 4.5% rise on year. Kia Motors also performed well with sales up nearly 13%. Auto sales in the U.S. usually pick up in the month of April, but this year the boost was pronounced. Total car sales rose to about 1.4 million, the highest level since 2006, before the financial crisis.
Now, the Korean economy expanded by 3.9% in the first quarter from a year earlier, beating the market forecast of 3.7%. The Bank of Korea expects growth of 4% this year, up from 3% last year.
The BOK's optimism was underlined by the 1.5% on-year rise in the Consumer Price Index for April, the biggest since a matching increase seen in August last year. However, the nation's consumer sentiment has been hit hard by the ferry tragedy in this country, raising concerns that the growth target may not be met this year.
For analysis, we are joined live in the studio by Dr. Kim In-cheol, Professor of International Economics at Seongkyungwon University. Professor Kim, thank you for joining us.
Well, glad to be here.
Now, the Korean economy grew 3.9% in the first quarter of this year from a year earlier. Now, if it were to achieve this 4% growth target, would it be safe to say that the Korean economy is back on the normal recovery, normal growth track?
Well, unfortunately, I should say it's not safe to say that, because the figure 3.9% growth, seems very impressive. But you have to remember that that is, annualized quarterly growth rate for the first quarter of 2014. Now, the quarter-to-quarter growth rate is only 0.9%. Now, if, say, the economy grows 0.9% every quarter, the annual growth would be a little over 3.6%. But the problem is with the second quarter. The second quarter growth was, the prospect for the second quarter growth is very weak because of the ferry disaster. So I would say that the economy is not being put on the normal track yet.
Even if the economy grew at this 4% mark, a lot of experts are saying that the average Korean, the local consumer, is not really feeling the effects of this economic recovery.
Yes, because these years, I mean, we can analyze the growth performance by focusing on the private consumption and the business corporate firms' investment and the government spending. Now, of these three components, corporate firm is taking a very predominant role in the macroeconomy, because they're the ones who leading the economy forward, while enjoying the lion's share of economic fruit. And consumers are very weak in the sense that their purchasing power is being very weak. And these days, they stop spending, by canceling their travel plans and, all different programs and events because of, the ferry tragedy. So consumers are not really, taking a big role in macro economy.
Right, but prior to the Sewol-ho ferry tragedy, of course, the Bank of Korea had said that consumer spending was picking up and that Korean consumers were actually opening up their wallets. So is that the case?
Yeah, I mean, we were hoping that could happen, but the thing is that these years household debt is so high, so their debt burden is unbearably getting high. So unless the government reduces and tries to cut the burden of the household debt, we cannot expect too much from the consumer spending increase.
So why does an event like the Sewol-ho ferry have such a huge impact on the domestic economy, and how does that reverberate in the medium to long term?
Yeah, because we will have a lot of negative economic impact on the economy, especially the second quarter. And Korean people are so sentimental, and they're very sympathetic with the families who lost children, and they're not really spending much. So the second quarter growth performance is going to be very poor, and I hope actually this tragedy is not going to have an impact on the economy in the third quarter. Having said that, the tragedy will have a very significant long-term impact on the people, because this tragedy will remain as one of the worst traumas inflicting the people for a long time to come.
Definitely. So let me ask you this. What are some measures that could or should be taken by the government to boost consumer spending, thus boost economic growth?
Okay. There could be a few measures to stimulate the economy or to boost the economy. The government can reduce the burden of their debt, the low interest rate. And do something to relieve the cost or the burden of the debt. And secondly, the government can improve the investment environment in Korea. And at the same time, the Bank of Korea, which is in charge of monetary policy, can provide or inject more currency into the economy, and perhaps they can reduce a little bit the interest rate.
All right. Well, Dr. Kim, thank you so much for sharing your insights with us tonight.
My pleasure.
And it's time now to get a check on the weather conditions. And for that, our Michelle Park joins us.
Well, not favorable for diverse conditions went on today, and strong winds and poor visibility due to the fog and strong currents are hampering efforts. Now, however, the conditions are expected to improve on Saturday with clear skies and tides finally slowing down. Now, for the rest of the nation, we can expect perfect spring-like weather conditions across the nation, but enjoy it while you can, because nationwide rain is in the forecast on Sunday with a slight drop in the temperatures. Now, looking ahead to the holiday weekend here in Korea, as you can see, the highs are on the warm side. However, keep in mind that temperatures will vary wide between the mornings and the day. Now, going over to our temperature readings, Seoul will start off the morning at 9 degrees before reaching up to 19 in the afternoon. Meanwhile, the southern cities such as Daegu and Busan will peak up to 24 and 22 degrees. Now, moving over to other regions, Jeju Island tops out at 18, Dokdo at 17, while Mankumgang tops out at 12. Well, that's all I have for you tonight. I'm Michelle Park, and back to you guys.
That brings us to the end of our newscast. Thanks for watching. For our viewers in Korea, have a wonderful rest of the evening.
And a great start of the day to those of you in other parts of the world.
This has been Sean Lim.
And I'm Moon Gan-young, and we'll see you right back here next week. Bye-bye.